It's Friday, February 26th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today in the show, we've got a two-parter. First, Republicans in the House passed their budget, and it undermines a key campaign and presidential promise from Donald Trump. Then, Donald Trump holds his first cabinet secretary meeting, and Elon Musk is there, despite not being a cabinet-level secretary or even the head of an agency, which we learned just this week. But let's start with the budget. So for weeks now, House Republicans had been working on a way to fund the government that they could agree on. They have the smallest margin in history to pass anything right now. If there are any two defectors in the House, GOP bills won't get passed without getting help from Democrats, which they obviously don't want to do because that means making compromises. Now, that didn't happen here, although there were moments where maybe it looked like this was going to fall through. Around 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock on Tuesday night, the entire budget was set for a vote, but then called off just before it was set to happen. That was a pretty damaging blow, it seemed at the time, to Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, which every time I talk about one of these budget fights, I do need to say that Mike Johnson, in order to become the most powerful person in Congress and the third in line to the presidency, had to cut this deal with members of his own party that said basically at any point in time, any single one of them could come up and say they don't have confidence anymore and call for a vote for him to lose his job. And that means catering most often to the most extreme members of his party. So pretty much any time things don't go exactly as planned, as exactly as smoothly as possible, Johnson's job is on the line. So when that vote was called off, things didn't look great. It was postponed, and members of Congress started to leave for the evening because they thought that the fight over the budget would restart in the morning. In fact, that was what was being said around the Capitol building at that point in time. But then, as soon as many members had left, the vote was back on. And now there are a lot of reasons that this could have happened. It could have been a member changed their mind after this vote was ended. It could have been that somehow Johnson and other leadership members of the Republican Party cut a deal with a member who was a holdout. Or, as a lot of Democrats alleged, it was Republicans who tried to pull a fast one on them, hoping that Democratic members wouldn't be able to get back to the Capitol in time, meaning the total number of votes would drop, giving Republicans a little more wiggle room to pass their budget. And they did, although it's not an official budget. And stick with me here because this is a little bit in the weeds. What the House passed is what you'll normally hear called as a budget framework, because while the budget is supposed to start in the House and then go to the Senate, and then they go back and forth for a little while until they compromise, the House was taking so long that the Senate decided to leapfrog them and agree on a budget framework of their own. And that kickstarts a process called reconciliation, which means the House doesn't have to set a budget itself before looking to compromise with the Senate. They just need an outline of sorts. It also prevents Democrats in the Senate from blocking the budget over there at the last minute because it's already been passed. So what was in this thing from the House? Well, it would do quite a few things, but a few huge ones. First, it would extend and expand the Trump tax plan from 2017, which a recent study from the nonpartisan nonprofit Institute on Taxation of Economic Policy, which is a group of national economists, they found that the vast majority of Americans would actually see their taxes go up between $600 to nearly $1,800, while the wealthiest Americans, people who make more than $915,000 a year, would see a drop in their taxes by more than $36,000. In all, that means a drop in federal revenue from the richest Americans to the tune of about $1.3 trillion, with another $700 billion in spending cuts planned on top of that. That plan, according to a study from the nonprofit, the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget, found the plan would explode the national debt by 132 to 149% if there were no offsets. Now, I've talked about here on how really nobody cares about the debt or the deficit because no one thinks the U.S. is going to default on that debt. But it's important because there are offsets in this and they're going to hurt a lot of people if they actually happen. So to offset the cost of the tax cuts, which means these tax cuts are going to bring in as much money, and the government needs to find that money to fill that back in from somewhere else. Well, Republicans want to cut $230 billion from food stamps or SNAP, which helps feed hungry families and provide things like fresh food to people who live in places that have a hard time getting decent food, like people who live in urban food deserts or in rural areas where it's just hard to get supplies. And then they want to cut $880 billion from Medicaid services that help tens of millions of Americans get vital care. And this is the thing where Republicans and Donald Trump run into a lot of problems, because it was a part of the 2024 campaign for pretty much every single Republican that they weren't going to come after Medicaid services. Here's Mike Johnson saying it just 2 weeks ago.
Look, Medicaid has never been on the chopping block. What we're talking about is finding the it's non-benefit related reforms to the program, right? Medicaid is infamous for fraud, waste, and abuse. I mean, by some estimates, large percentages of the dollars that are allocated there are wasted and stolen. And so we do right to go into those programs and find that and show the people what's happened and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah, so all that sounds great, right? Except it's not really, true. I've talked about this before, but what Johnson is doing here, and it's hard to know exactly the numbers he's pulling from because he doesn't say what his source is, but a recent Government Accountability Office report found that there were more than $50 billion roughly in what were called improper payments from Medicaid. And while it sounds bad, it isn't all fraud. It's important to say first here that there are no reliable estimates of how much fraud is actually happening in the Medicaid system, which is something that has been found for more than a decade by the Congressional Budget Office. But those improper payments can mean underpayments to people who actually qualify for more help. It's overpayments that are the government's fault. It's poor record keeping, like accidentally sending a check to somebody with the same name who also lives at the same address. But those aren't instances of fraud and would be incredibly difficult for Congress to wipe away without doing blanket cuts that would be incredibly disruptive to millions of people who actually do need help. And then when we talk about real Medicaid fraud, it's almost never individuals committing fraud. In a report that came out just last December from the Department of Health and Human Services, in all of the Medicaid fraud in 2023, not a single Medicaid beneficiary, so not a single person, was listed as the cause of any of that fraud, meaning all of that fraud came from healthcare providers, insurance companies, pharmacies, and senior care facilities, among other places. So Johnson is wrong here to imply that lazy poor people on the Medicaid rolls are committing a lot of the fraud, although that is who they'll be going after. And then, just as importantly here, Donald Trump said that Medicaid wouldn't be touched in an interview last week on Fox News.
Look, Social Security won't be touched. Other than if there's fraud or something, we're going to find it's going to be strengthened, but won't be touched. Medicare, Medicaid, none of that stuff is going to be touched.
Nothing.
You don't have to. Now.
So Medicaid wouldn't be touched. But in the time between that interview last week and this week, Trump has done an about-face because he fully endorsed the plan on social media, saying it will end in one big, beautiful bill. Now, inside that bill, you're also going to hear a lot of people saying that there are things like no tax on overtime, no tax on tips, no coming after senior Americans. Those aren't a part of the bill, but in the last 24 hours or so, we have seen quite a few Republicans coming out saying that. I'm not sure why they're saying that. They might not have read this bill themselves. They just know that Donald Trump is backing it, and so they're just kind of doing the greatest hits from the campaign. But it's worth you knowing that those things aren't in there. So what happens next on this? Well, it isn't a done deal. Democrats do have ways of holding things up and will likely do those things, but that could be a losing battle for them, one that Mike Johnson is already talking about.
Chairman Tom Cole addressed the House Republicans this morning on the latest developments. about how we may be getting close to a number on that. The problem is the Democrats have added something new and different that's never been part of this before. They are trying to add to the appropriations bill a demand that they want us to somehow limit the ability of the executive branch to do its job. They want to tie the hands of the president on what he is able to do with the expenditures in the executive branch. That's never been done before.
Now, again, I don't know what Mike Johnson is talking about here on actually either point he made. He might be referring to Jamie Raskin, the congressman from Maryland, who is the ranking member, the highest ranking Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, who told Politico recently that Democrats want Congress to step up when it comes to Elon Musk overrunning Congress's power to control federal spending, which is outlined in the very first part of the Constitution. And then Johnson is also just lying here about it not being Congress's job to oversee the president and how he spends money. That is practically the entire point of Congress. But the thing to know is that this was only the first round of fighting over the budget. Some of these things are subject to change, but likely not by much. And with the Republican majority slim in both the House and the Senate, we could see another party breakdown from Republicans like we saw in the last two rounds of budget fights, or we could see Democrats wind up owning a government shutdown, or both. But we will know that in 2 weeks. Now, speaking of Elon Musk a little earlier, that brings us to the president's very first cabinet meeting of his second term. And Elon Musk was in the room. Now, these are regular meetings that the president is meant to get updates from his cabinet secretaries, the heads of his departments. So that's people like the secretaries of Defense, Commerce, Homeland Security, the Office of Personnel Management, Budget, Health and Human Services, or the secretaries of State and Education. And actually, speaking of education here, Linda McMahon, who is, yes, from the WWE Pro Wrestling McMahons, was seated at the table with the rest of the secretaries, even though she actually isn't confirmed yet, which isn't supposed to be allowed, but that's kind of beside the point, because a lot of the focus was on Elon Musk, who wasn't sitting at the table. He was sort of standing at the long end, at the head of the table, which was kind of weird, too. It wasn't like he was sitting right next to the president, but the whole thing was just weird. Anyway, Musk is not a cabinet secretary. He's not even the head of a department, and that's not because the Department of Government Efficiency isn't a real department. It's not one. Trump just rebranded the U.S. digital services to be Doge, but it's because Elon isn't even in charge of Doge. And we know that because for weeks now, a federal judge has been trying to get the government's lawyers to tell them who is actually in charge of running this Department of Government Efficiency, and these lawyers have refused to say, both in court documents and in court in front of the judge. Now, this is partially because Doge isn't, like I said, an actual department, but also because the White House has gone out of its way to shield Musk and his team of college-aged accomplices here from certain laws that would apply to specific agency employees. So things like the Freedom of Information requests or certain financial disclosures. That's why there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of news stories about whether Musk is actually a special government employee or whether the people under him are getting paid by taxpayer dollars, or if Musk is actually going to be leading this agency, which means he'd need to submit a financial disclosure form about his billions of dollars in government contracts or his conflicts of interest, both in the American government but also with foreign governments. But this week, the government decided to solve that problem by naming an absolutely random woman named Amy Gleason as the acting administrator of Doge, or you can listen to how the White House press secretary explained it.
So Amy Gleason has been the Doge administrator for quite some time, I believe several weeks, maybe a month. I'm not actually sure of the specific timeline. She's a career official. She's doing her job as the administrator of this organization. I know everybody's very interested in her name and who she is and what she does. There's a lot of people who work for the federal government. They're just trying to do their jobs, and, that's what she's doing.
Doge staffers told us yesterday that they found out about her being the administrator yesterday. Why is that?
You have to ask them. They're clearly unaware. I don't know.
Did you
Rachel.
announce her position to the rest of the Doge
Everybody knew, and we said who she was to all of you because you are hounds in the media who are so obsessed with this for some reason. So in the effort of transparency, we told you who that person is.
So this is gaslighting. I don't know what else to call it. To pretend that Gleason has been in charge of this thing the whole time and we just haven't known about it is nonsense. If that was the case, the lawyers would have just said it in court and not had to go through this back and forth with this judge. Gleason now does have some history with USDS, but she's just some person they picked so that reporters would get off the back of Elon Musk. But she has been picked nonetheless, which might be why Musk showed up to an official cabinet meeting wearing his new government Reaper uniform of black jeans, black coat, a black MAGA hat, and a black t-shirt. This time it said tech support on it, and he made a little joke and said he's just a humble tech guy for the government here. Now, it's not uncommon for advisors to be at these meetings if that is indeed what Musk's role actually is here, but it is really uncommon for them to say anything at all. Usually they just kind of sit along the walls in stiff chairs and shift uncomfortably while these things happen. But that wasn't the case for Elon Musk. He was the first person to speak after Donald Trump and then the HUD secretary, the Housing and Urban Development secretary, who said a prayer over this cabinet meeting, which is a little unusual for these things, but that's kind of neither here nor there. Musk was a huge focus of this, and he said a lot of things about the stuff that he and his people have been doing, and there were a lot of the same lies and misdirection that I've talked about a lot in recent episodes, including Musk saying that he wants to cut $1 trillion from the federal budget, which actually caught my attention because that's half of what he'd been promising and what he certainly promised on the campaign trail, which was a promise to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget. But it appears that after a month of slashing and burning his way through the government, that plan has shrunk. It's worth pointing out here that there have been a number of analyses by news outlets that have shown that Musk's claims about quote-unquote savings have proven to either be not actual savings at all. The AP just did one that found 40% of the contracts that Doge was cutting were either already finished but were just still on the books because of accounting needs and wouldn't actually save the government any money, or were things that had already been canceled by the previous administration. They've also found that Doge's numbers are riddled with errors, including a part that forced employees to delete their 5 biggest accomplishments last week, and NBC News found that many of the cuts will actually cost the U.S. money because they're making things less efficient. And here, Musk copped to a little bit of that, saying, again, that Doge was going to get things wrong, like this on Ebola.
And I should say, we will make mistakes. We won't be perfect. But when we make a mistake, we'll fix it very quickly. So, for example, with USAID, one of the things we accidentally canceled very briefly was Ebola, Ebola prevention. I think we all want Ebola prevention. So we restored the Ebola prevention immediately, and there was no interruption.
Musk there just saying, whoops, my bad, acting like Ebola isn't incredibly dangerous and that there isn't a mystery illness in Africa that's killing people faster than doctors can understand what's happening to their patients, except there absolutely is right now. But things moved on in this meeting, and there was some focus on that email request that Musk sent out over the weekend to 2 million, the more than 2 million federal workers, asking them to explain what they did over the weekend in an email or that they be fired. This decree was sent out on X by Musk, forcing the Office of Personnel Management to scramble and send a much more formal request for this thing. Now, I wrote about this on the Make It Make Sense Substack yesterday. That order was eventually walked back in part, basically ended up saying it was voluntary, but so far about 1 million federal employees have responded to that email, meaning half have not. And here is what Trump said when Musk was asked about whether those people could still be fired.
I'd like to add that those 1 million people that haven't responded, though, Elon, they are on the bubble. You know, I wouldn't say that we're thrilled about it. You know, they haven't responded. Now, maybe they don't exist Maybe we're paying people that don't exist. Don't forget, we just got here. This group just got here. But those people are on the bubble, as they say. Maybe they're going to be gone. Maybe they're not around. Maybe they have other jobs. Maybe they moved.
Take that in for just a minute here. 1 million people whose jobs are on the line, so says the president, for not answering a voluntary email that was made voluntary by his administration. Now, as that meeting was happening, a memo from the Office of Personnel Management went out telling agencies and departments to get ready for RIFs, RIFs, or reduction in force mass layoffs, which I'm not sure how much more some of these agencies can take. But the other staggering thing here is that Trump and Musk keep repeating this claim that there might be dead people working, quote unquote, for the government and receiving government paychecks. They've never offered any proof of these things. It is absolutely likely nonsense. And sending a mass email would be a very weird way to try to find that out. Not to mention, most recently, Musk and Trump have not had a good track record of proving that they found dead people being paid by the government, because when they just tried to say that there were millions of people who were dead or over the age of 100 years old receiving Social Security, well, it turned out that that was just a misunderstanding from Musk's part about the coding that the Social Security Administration uses, even though coding is his whole thing. I mean, he's the tech support guy, right? But the most tense part of this meeting came when a reporter asked Musk about whether he'd heard about any cabinet-level secretaries who were unhappy with him. Obviously, this was a question in response to those departments that had told employees not to answer this email from Musk, like the Department of Defense and Homeland Security and the FBI. And it was here that Trump interjected, and it went like this.
So, any dissatisfaction?
Maybe you want to let the cabinet speak just for a second. Is anybody unhappy with Elon? If you are, we'll throw them out of here. Is anybody unhappy? They have a lot of respect for Elon and that he's doing this, and some disagree a little bit, but I will tell you, for the most part, I think everyone's not only happy, they're thrilled. So go ahead, Elon. I'm grateful.
Ooh, is that awkward? It was really clear that nobody in this room wants to go against Trump, and they know the consequences if they do, and that clearly here in this extremely official high-level meeting now extends to Elon Musk. That might have been something that we knew before, but now it was made clear to the people who hold the highest offices in our government that Elon Musk is clearly running at least part of the show out of this new Trump White House. And speaking of shows, that is all for our show today. If you like the show, please rate and review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on, like and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new videos. You can subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got brand new content up all the time over there, including one that I'm planning to put up this week about the fight to end gay marriage in America, kicked off this week here in the state of Michigan. And as always, please share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you on Friday.